I would like to begin by just saying I just switched channels after watching the inaugural ceremonies from the United States. And I was actually very, very moved and inspired by President Biden's inaugural speech. In fact, he even mentioned something which is a good segue to our parsha, which is we have to open up our hearts and not harden them. So I guess he must have had contact with somebody in terms of the timing. And I just would like to take my opportunity to send my prayer and hope that President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris will in fact be able to succeed to lead America on the path of unity and healing and be able to bring to all of us the hope for a much better future. On another note, I would like to dedicate tonight's shiur to the memory of a former Pardes student, Ben McDonald, who passed away a number of days ago. Ben was actually a young man when he passed away at the age of 31. And I would just like to say that Ben was a student of mine. My memory of Ben is someone who had a tremendous curiosity and love of learning Torah, and not just as something very abstract, but as something that he sought to incorporate in his life. I will always remember his good nature, his boyish smile, and I hope that his love of Torah and his passion for life is something that will be a legacy for all of us. May his memory be a blessing. So tonight I would like to pick up from where we left off last week. And as a refresher, I mentioned last week that it's very interesting how the rabbis who divided the parshiot, the Torah readings, split up the 10 plagues so that 7 were in last week's parsha, 3 are in this week's parsha. And for those of you who remember, an easy way to remember that is the numerical value of the word bo, bet aleph, which is 3. Last week we spoke about also another division, which appears in the Haggadah of Rabbi Yehuda, who split up the plagues in 3 sets of 3, 3, 4. In each set of plagues, there's a certain educational message. In the first series, as I noted to you last week in chapter 7, verse 17, it says, in order that you should know that I am Hashem. In the second series, which begins with the 4th plague, it's in chapter 8, verse 18, in order that you should know that I am Hashem in the midst of the land. And then we spoke about the 7th plague at the end of the shiur last week, which is chapter 9, verse 14, in order that you should know that there is none like me. And at the time I mentioned to you that what characterizes the 7th plague, and this is perhaps why the rabbis made this the end of last week's parsha, was that this was actually the last opportunity for Pharaoh to exercise his free will, to come to a real recognition of God. And I would also add, at the very least, to show some semblance of humanity, some semblance of concern for his own people, if not the Jewish people, by doing everything that he possibly could to make sure that no one would remain out in the fields okay, and as a result died from the hail. And what we see at the end of last week's parsha is what we call too little, too late. That yes, it's the first time where Pharaoh acknowledges that some type of wrongdoing, but it's, I made a mistake this time. And even Moshe says to Pharaoh, I know that you really are not serious. So that our parsha is really a turning point. Because from this point on in our parsha, Pharaoh does not have free will. And in a certain sense, it's playing out the rest of the plagues. And if we just look at the beginning of the parsha, okay, if everyone will look in chapter 10, verse 1. Vayomer Adonai Moshe, God says to Moshe, Bo el Paro, come to Pharaoh. Ki ani hichbadati et libo, I've hardened his heart and the heart of his servants. Leman shiti ototai ele bikirbo, in order to place these signs of mine in his midst. Ulemaan, this is verse 2, to saper ba'oznei vincha, that you will tell in the ears of your children and your grandchildren, et asher hitalalti b'Mitzrayim, how I toyed in Egypt, vet ototai asher samti bam, and the signs which I placed in their midst. And then perhaps what's important for us is vida'atem ki ani Adonai, and you will know that I am God. I just want to comment parenthetically. There are two words that appear during the plagues, which actually have very, very different meaning. In Hebrew, the two words are otot umoftim. And very often people will read them interchangeably, but they're very different. The word ot, aleph vav taf, which appears in the verses I read, means a sign. A sign is something that directs us, that we learn from. A mofet, mem vav pei taf, is a wonder. It's something which I'm amazed at, but it doesn't really direct me. It doesn't educate me. I just maybe am amazed, but that's about it. And that becomes a major question in all the plagues which happen in Egypt. Are these signs or are these wonders? And what seems to be happening is that for Pharaoh, they're a wonder. Wow, that was a great trick. That's pretty unbelievable that you did that. But do I, in the end, learn something from it? And the answer is no. What will happen, and that's what's being articulated in our parsha, is that the plagues are now meant to be signs, but signs in particular for the Jewish people. So that at the end of verse 2, it says, Vidatem ki ani Hashem, so that you will know that I am God. On a certain level, it's as if God has given up on Pharaoh, and perhaps even you could say the Egyptian people, in coming to some type of recognition of God. But if it's not going to happen with Pharaoh, then at least by doing all the things which God is doing to Pharaoh and the Egyptian people, maybe the Jewish people will learn from this, and they will come to that recognition of God. So I would like to begin by looking at the opening plague of our parsha, which is the plague of locusts. And I'd like to actually say that we don't have the time to do this now. Hopefully I will give many more live with Rav Meir sessions in the future, and maybe next year we'll talk about, okay, the different types of plagues and the significance of them. And I want to just focus on one aspect, and I'll just want to point out though before I do this that it's, if you really look at the plagues carefully, there are many different types of connections you can find between the different plagues. And I'll just mention this now because that's not what I want to focus on. When I look at the plague of locusts, it's clear that the plague of locusts is a natural follow-up to the plague of hail. If the plague of hail, in effect, destroys, the barley which is now in the fields, the plague of locusts is now completing that process of the destruction of the produce. If in the plague of hail, it emphasizes this is something which never happened before. In the plague of locusts, it also says this is something which never happened at any point. This is radically different. I would like to begin by focusing on a different parallel, which is the parallel between the plague of locusts and the plague of frogs. Now, in what way are these two plagues similar? So what we have is the following. If you look at the plague of both plagues, well, let's look at verse 14, chapter 10, verse 14. Or maybe even before I do that, maybe let me look at verse 6. It says, Umalu batecha, and your houses will be filled, uvatecha lavadecha, and the houses of all your servants, uvatecha Mitzrayim, the houses of all of Egypt, asher lo ra'u avotecha v'avot avotecha, which your ancestors have never seen from the days, right, that they were on this earth. But what are they filled with? Okay, they're being filled with the locusts. Go back to chapter 8. And if you look at chapter 8, in chapter, or actually even before that, well, okay, let's look at chapter 7, verse 28, where it says, and the Nile will swarm with frogs. They will go up and come into your house, into your bedroom, into your bed, and then it says in the next verse, uvacha uva'amcha, and in you, in your people, and your servants. So you have these two images of the frogs and of the locusts, which are penetrating into your house. And by the locusts, it's even highlighted more by saying they'll fill it up. Now that's one expression. There's a second expression which appears by both of them, and that is the idea of going up. So that if you look at that verse which I just mentioned by the frogs, it says, let me just find it. At the end of verse 29, it says, in you and your people and in all of your servants, the frogs will go up. And then if you look at chapter 8, verse 2, it says, Aaron lifted up his hand on the waters, and the frog went up. If you look in our parsha by the locusts, chapter 10, verse 14, it says, Vaya'al ha'arbeh. And the locusts, and it actually even says it in the singular, which we could understand as the locust, came up. So I just tried to show you certain literary parallels between the two. And then you say, okay, that's interesting. So what? Now, I mentioned last time, and I'll mention it again, that the major purpose of the plagues was not to be punitive, but to actually be educational. And last time, and even today, I said to you that, well, what's the education? Well, the education has to do with an awareness of God, right? In different levels of awareness, that there is Hashem, a transcendent God, that there is a God who is actually not only transcendent, but very much hands-on, involved in what's happening down below here. And then there's something unique about God, which again, I mentioned last week in terms of God's exercising the utmost compassion, even to God's enemies. But I now want to focus on a different educational dimension. And that is for Pharaoh and the Egyptian people to essentially confront what they had perpetrated against the Jews. And I'm just going to bring up two examples and then speak about, the frogs and the locusts. The first plague is the plague of blood. The Nile turns into blood. Why? So you'll find in Midrashic literature that it speaks about how the Nile is a god of Egypt, and that when God is quote unquote waging warfare, the first thing which God does is to knock down what the Egyptians hold as being sacred. Essentially, to kill their God, so to speak. But there's another point to the Nile turning into blood, which is essentially reflecting to Pharaoh and the Egyptian people what they actually did. They were the ones who took the Nile, which is a source of life, and then they turned it into a burial place with all those Jewish baby boys that they threw into the Nile. And in fact, right, this is something which we didn't go into. When Pharaoh's daughter is going to the Nile, this was her moment of truth, to confront what was happening in the Nile. And she rose to the occasion and saved the Jewish baby. But Pharaoh and the general Egyptian population ignored it. And here is God, who through the plagues is forcing them to confront what they themselves had done in terms of taking a source of life and making it into a place of death. There is beyond the educational message of Pharaoh and the Egyptian people coming to a recognition of God, there's also the educational message of the evil which they perpetrated against the Jews. You might say the lies which they perpetrated about the Jews. The projected image of the Jews, which was a lie, but then became, as I said, a self-fulfilling prophecy in reality with the plagues that happened. What I would like to look at now is another aspect of the plague of locusts. I mentioned how you could see the connection between the locusts and the frogs, and certainly between the locusts and the hail. But there's another element to this, and that is chapter 10, verse 5, where it says, V'chisa et ein haaretz, v'lo yuchal lirot et haaretz. They will cover up the eye of the earth, and you won't be able to see the earth. Now, what is the eye of the earth? You could say the surface of the earth, what you can see with your eye, or the way I think it should be understood is actually the sun. So, and if any of you ever saw, this is an old movie that was The Good Earth, based on the book by Pearl Buck. I'll never forget, there was a scene of locusts. And then you see how the locusts really cover up, darken the sky. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because the locusts actually become a foreshadowing of the next plague, which is the plague of darkness, and what I might even say of the continuation, which is the plague of the firstborn, which happens in the middle of the night. And I might even add what will happen later on at the Red Sea, when the ultimate demise of the Egyptians happens at the end of the night, which means that there is this motif of darkness. So that's what I would like to now look at, and why the darkness is so important in terms of being the end of the plagues. So if you look at chapter 10, verse 21. Vayomer Adonai Moshe, God says to Moshe, Netei yadcha al hashamayim, stretch out your hand to the heavens, on the heavens literally. V'hi choshech al eretz Mitzrayim, let there be darkness on the land of Egypt. V'yamesh choshech. Now this phrase in the Hebrew, v'yamesh, is not at all clear. And I'm going to come back to it in one moment. And then in verse 22 and 23, we're told, and Moshe turned his hand to the heaven, Vayihi choshech afela b'chol eretz Mitzrayim shloshet yamim. There was a darkness, and the word afela is another word for darkness, which we'll also come back to, for 3 days. Lo ra'u ishet achiv, a person did not see his brother. V'lo kamu ish mitachtav, and one could not get up from his place. Shloshet yamim, for 3 days. U'lechol b'nei Yisrael haya or b'moshvotam, and to all the children of Israel there was light in their dwellings. So I would like to now examine a number of elements that have to do with this plague of darkness. The first being the phrase that we saw at the end of 21, V'yamesh choshech. What does it mean, V'yamesh? And there are two essential interpretations, and it has to do also with what is the root of this word. Rashi, Ibn Ezra, and a number of other commentaries say that the root of V'yamesh is the word in Hebrew Aleph Mem Shin. Aleph Mem Shin is the word for Emesh, which means last night. And Rashi says, well, what does that mean? The darkness of last night will continue and be even darker. So that it's the idea that, there's this intensified form of darkness which is coming about. Rashi then quotes a midrash which says that the root is actually mem shin shin, limashesh. Limashesh means to feel. And then Rashi says that this was a darkness that was so intense that you could actually feel it. And by the way, the sheet that I gave you, so I gave you the Ramban. I should have given you the Ibn Ezra, but unfortunately in the Bar Ilan, it didn't have the part in the Ibn Ezra that I wanted, where the Ibn Ezra actually starts going into this whole thing about how this darkness is like what you find in the ocean. And essentially he was talking about fog, which is so intense that, in other words, you actually can kind of feel it. By the way, Nachmanides, in the sheet that was just posted, the Ramban, really goes out of his way to emphasize that the darkness is not just the absence of light, but it was an actual creation. It was something that was tangible. And he even makes the point of saying it's so tangible that you can't dispel the darkness by simply lighting a candle, right? Or making a fire. It's like, it's something which is so tangible, it will like suffocate any type of light source that you try to create. So that it's very interesting that at least among quite a few sources, they see this darkness as being something which is, as I said, very, very tangible, very, very real, to the point where it makes it impossible, right, to dispel the darkness with any form of light. I want to now look at another point which comes up here. And again, this is a disagreement among commentaries. How long was this plague? So I think everybody will say, well, it says so, 3 days. But in fact, Rashi brings up that the darkness was actually 6 days, 2 sets of 3 days. And the Midrash which Rashi quotes, you might actually see in terms of the verses, because if you look at the end of verse 22, it says there was darkness for 3 days. And then at the kind of the middle of verse 23, it says 3 days a second time. And sandwiched between the 3 days, 2 phrases, 3 days, it says 2 things. Lo ra'u ishet achiv, you couldn't see your brother. Velo kamu, and you couldn't get up. And so according to the Midrashic understanding, there were actually 2 sets of 3 days, 2 phases of the darkness. The first phase was that you simply could not see what was going on. And there was no way that you could do anything, as I said, to get rid of the darkness. But the second phase, which was even more intense, was that it's not just you couldn't see, you couldn't move. It's like you were being locked into your place by the darkness. So the question arises, what was the point? Why have darkness? So I want to begin following up with what I mentioned before by the plague of blood and by the locusts and by the lice. That maybe there was a certain educational message over here to Pharaoh and the Egyptian people by experiencing this darkness, of experiencing what it means to be a slave. And essentially what the Jewish people experienced. And I want to look at it in 2 levels. On one level, right, the most elementary one, if I can't see anything, that can actually be very frightening.
So when the people are in this situation where they can't see what's going on around them. That makes them extremely vulnerable. And it somehow puts them in the position of what the Jewish people felt like being slaves. When they're unable to move for 3 days. I mean, I've tried to visualize this, to not be able to move, which means you're also not able to eat, which means if you have to use the facilities, right, it's not a pleasant experience. To be completely immobilized, that would be the ultimate expression of what it means to be enslaved. So that it's important for Pharaoh and the Egyptians to experience what the Jewish people went through. In the end, it doesn't seem that it necessarily, or maybe it did, made them more empathetic to the Jewish people. But it was a way of having, in a certain sense, the tables turned. Now I want to add another element. If you look at the end of verse 23, it says, Ulechol b'nei Yisrael haya or b'moshvotam. And to all the Jewish people, there was light in their dwellings. And there's a very interesting disagreement, again, among the commentaries. A number of commentaries say, well, that means that the Jewish people, where they dwelled, i.e. in the land of Goshen, had light. It was a way of highlighting what appeared in quite a few of the plagues as to how the plagues impacted on the Egyptians, but did not impact on the Jews. But we already find in Midrashim, and it's taken up even by the Pshat commentaries, those who are not trying to give you the Midrashic, but what they call even the simple way of reading the text, that in fact the Jews had light not only in the land of Goshen, but any place where the Jews moved, they had light. Which meant that even if Jews were in Egyptian territory, they had light. And then you have a number of midrashim that actually graphically describe how during the period of darkness, Jews are actually walking through Egyptian homes. When I taught this for many years at Pardes, so I used to say tongue-in-cheek, do a little bit of a kind of parody and say, oh, Shirley, look at those beautiful golden vases they have over there. Oh, Harry, how about those dishes there? And what about those beautiful clothes over there? That would be really great. We would love to have things like that. And so that there are midrashim that speak about how the Jews actually are doing a kind of inventory of what appears in Egyptian homes in anticipation of what's going to be in the next chapter, that God says to them that before you leave Egypt, you'll go to the Egyptians and ask them for clothing and for all kinds of items to take with you. So I want to digress for a moment from that angle of the Midrash and focus on another angle. And that is that when the tables are turned and the Jewish people now have light, and as a result of the light, that gives them mobility. One could also say as a result of the light, that gives them power. It's actually fascinating. During the period of darkness, the Jewish people could have very easily picked up and left Egypt. In the process, they could have very easily killed all of those Egyptians who had perpetrated all the violence against them. And yet we don't have any we certainly know the Jewish people did not pick up and leave. And we don't have any indication that the Jewish people at that point took any type of revenge against their persecutors. And perhaps that's an even more powerful educational message which is being given to the Egyptian people. That when the tables are turned and the Jewish people have the power, have the ability to now do whatever they want against the Egyptians, they don't exercise that power. They don't abuse that power. And this perhaps becomes a different type of model, which leads me into the next point of why the plagues seem to be going towards a place of darkness. It's not only darkness, but it's 6 days of darkness. And I'm sure the number 6 actually is a charged number for people, which perhaps reminds us of the 6 days of creation. And perhaps what we're now being shown is how the plagues are now moving in a direction which is unraveling creation in Egypt, which is bringing Egypt to what might be called a primordial state, where there was chaos, where there was darkness on the depths. And we know that the first act of creation, which is actually recorded, specific act, is the creation of light and the separation of the light from the darkness. So that as Egypt is unraveling and being destroyed and being brought, as I said, to this primordial state, at that very same moment, the Jewish people are now beginning and laying the foundations of the creation of a Jewish people/state. And that's very much connected with the light. And since I see my time is running out, so I'll just say the following. Our Parsha is a turning point in another way. And that is, until the end of last week's Parsha, and we spoke quite a bit about this idea of redemption, it's God who has been very much active in the redemption process. And in many ways, the Jewish people are spectators. But what begins to happen in our Parsha is that the Jewish people become active participants in their own redemption. And maybe the first step in that process is in this plague of darkness. When the Jewish people, as I said, the tables are turned, they now have the ability to do a whole variety of things as a result of their new mobility, which is the beginning of their real beginning of their freedom. the way that what they display is their self-restraint. And that's maybe the idea of the light. Not just that God gives them the ability to see physically, but that the Jewish people are also displaying a certain light, maybe the beginning of a certain set of values, just in their very self-restraint. And we're not going to get to it today, but this may also be connected with how God says to them before they people ask them for clothing, for silver and gold. And this is part of a whole discussion, and I'm just going to give you the bottom line, right, which is what I certainly subscribe to. When the Jewish people are asking them for these things, essentially, it's what you might call severance pay. It's reparations. But it's not even reparations. It's the means to give the Jewish people the ability to now become free, to take on a new persona, to have the means to be able to create a new life. And they have to be the ones who go to the Egyptians. They have to be the ones who essentially are saying to the Egyptians, give us these things, which is another way of saying, give us the means by which we can now become a free people. And then subsequently in chapter 12, which essentially is giving all the laws of the first Seder that the Jewish people experienced as a people, which then became the model for the future. By engaging in all the laws which are given to them in chapter 12, which is the first time the Jewish people as a people are given laws, the Jewish people are doing those things which will now redeem themselves. Not just God doing it for them, but they have to do something themselves. They have to demonstrate their freedom, not after they leave Egypt, but before they leave Egypt. And that essentially is what we have in our Parashat. So that if I began the shir with the opening verses which said that God is bringing these signs which essentially for the Jewish people, so they should know God, it's not only that they should know God, but by somehow now embracing and understanding what's happening in terms of the plagues, the Jewish people can now set in motion the process of becoming partners with God in their redemption process and of actually actively making the movement of going from slavery to freedom.